Okay, we're going to get started. Pay attention to me, I'm important. Okay, here we go. Okay, good. Welcome to Pinterest, or the Discover Pinterest event. I am Everett Milam. Was it for my slide change? I am an engineering manager here at Pinterest, focused on product engineering. Today we're going to talk about mobile design and engineering, how those two fit together. So we have Luke Robalski, Wendy Liu, one of our iOS engineers, and Carl Rice, another one of our engineers here. And that will be our focus for today. So Luke focusing on screen time, Wendy on rebuilding new user mobile education, and then Carl on optimizing the Pinterest Android experience. Before I forget, if you did not get a copy, we have a book for everyone at the front called Universal Principles of Design. We chose this book because design has become more and more important in Silicon Valley. It's crazy to see how much it's taken over. It used to be kosher to use blink tags and marquee tags. That's all looked down on today. I'm still trying to sneak them into Pinterest. A couple of days I'm going to get one there, blinking the Pinterest logo, but haven't done that yet. So before we jump in, I'm going to give you a little introduction to Pinterest engineering and Pinterest in general. So hopefully you all know about Pinterest. It's focused around a pin. Now, a pin is an object. It has a link and an image attached to it. In a lot of cases, it also has a description and metadata. The description is optional, but something we require is for a pinner to put this pin on a board. And this board helps us understand the intent behind a pin, why the pinner saved that pin. And many pinners end up pinning the same pin to different boards. So some may save it because they're interested in travel, photography, surf destinations, all these different reasons. And these pins and boards live on a user's profile with the rest of their pins and boards. And because of this, we're able to gather a lot of intent on users, and we're able to give them recommendations, help them discover other things that they're interested in. We do this a lot of times by looking at other pinners and why they pin this pin. And we can kind of look at these billions of pins that we have and cluster them into different interests. So you can see here with that Rio de Janeiro pin, some people may pin it because they're interested in travel. Others might do it because of surf destinations, and so on and so on. We look at this intent that the pinner pinned it for. We can recommend other pins in that same interest. We can recommend related interests for pinners to find content. And that's what we're focused on, is helping people discover, save, and do the things that they love. Our corpus has grown pretty large. We now have over 1 billion boards and over 50 billion pins on those boards. So big number. In the past, a little bit easier to do recommendations. Now there's a very much needle in a haystack. We do have all this curated information from pinners, but the discovery problem gets harder and harder. And it's also hard to show this content to users. We don't want to just show them millions of pins. We want to show them things that they're actually interested in. And that's why we believe that most of Pinterest hasn't been built yet. There's still a lot to be done, a lot of features that need to be added to help users discover content, to actually help them find the things that they would want to pin, that they would want to take action on. So to give you a little history of Pinterest and where it's gone, these are some of the early designs of the grid that we went through. Kind of crazy. And then this last one's something you might recognize, which was kind of the grid we have today. In 2012, Pinterest was mainly a web-based tool. We had an iPhone app, but not much usage there. And it was mainly known for its design in that iconic grid that we have. In the end of 2012, we actually took the time to revamp our iOS app. We built our first version of the Android app and the iPad app. And because of that, we now have over 80% of our traffic from pinners is on mobile devices. So that's pretty cool. We've also taken the time to change our focus in how we build things because of this. We used to build things on the desktop, maybe release them on mobile when we got around to it. Now we're very much mobile first and a lot of times mobile only. We also restructured our engineering teams to be focused on mobile too. We used to have a giant mobile team. We've put them all into different product engineering teams where they can each build features with a designer. So we take a designer and engineer and we put them together. They can prototype and they can build that feature. They can design it together and then release that. And that's what we're here to talk about today, is how design and engineering come together and the important principles there. I'm going to hand it over to Luke. Luke is a product director at Google. He's probably best known for the books he's written, the blog articles he has. I believe he has a book on mobile first. He has also had 2 of his startups acquired, one by Twitter and the other by Google. And Luke's going to be talking to us about screen time. Thank you, Luke.
Hello. Hello, pin pals. Can you pineer me? We're going to have a pintastic time here. I hope you find my pinsentation, Pinteresting. No? Okay. Sorry. When in Rome, I'm trying to speak the lingo, right? So, come here, give me a break. Okay, it's late in the day, so I would like to wake you guys up, and the best way to do that is audio cues. Somebody's getting the joke. That's cool. That's all right. Hopefully the rest of you will get there. So I want to talk about screen time, and this in general is really some things that have been on my mind these days when I think about building digital experiences for sort of the reality we have now, this multi-device, cross-device, very mobile-centric experience that people have with software. And in order to get us to where we are today, I want to back up a little bit and go back to 1952. And in 1952, I'm going to go all the way up to New Jersey and to the Corning Glass Works. See, at the Corning Glass Works in 1952, there was a chemist by the name of Don Stuckey. And Don Stuckey was running an experiment on glass. And the way you run experiments on glass is you take a bunch of glass, you put it in the oven, you heat it up, and you see what happens. Don had this special batch of photosensitive glass. And he put it in a furnace, as you do, and he set this experiment to run at 600 degrees Celsius. Unbeknownst to Don, this furnace happened to have a faulty controller. So instead of running this experiment at 600 degrees Celsius, he ended up running it at 900 degrees Celsius. As soon as he realized the error of his ways, he ran over to the furnace and he tried to get his glass out of there. Right? He opened it up, he pulls it with that rod thing. I don't know what you call that rod thing. It probably has a name. But he tries to take this glass out of the oven and he jostles it and it starts to fall. So what is your reaction when you see a hot piece of glass about to fall? You sort of brace for impact, right? And it turned out what actually happened was it bounced. Totally by accident, Don had invented the first synthetic glass ceramic. And you guys probably have all used Don's invention. In fact, he was recognized by, I think it was like a Nobel Prize for some thingamahoo. Don't they give that to people who are smart, right? He got some thingamahoo for it. But the reason why he did is because it was actually very impactful. If you have ever used pyrocerum, otherwise known as Corningware, to heat up a casserole or stew in your microwave, you've used what Don created. This substance, this pyrocerum as it's called, is harder than high carbon steel, but it's actually lighter than aluminum. And so it found its way into lots of applications, from everything from Corningware to the nose tips, the nose cones, if you will, of missiles. So this, needless to say, was real big business for Corning. Before this, they had just been making sheets of glass. Now they had something that they could sell to the military, that they could sell to the home. And they made lots and lots of money. So they realized, hey, there's something to this strong glass thing. We should invest a little more in this. And they kicked off an R&D effort to create even stronger glass. Internally, this project was called 0317. And about 10 years later, in 1962, whereas normal glass can take about 7,000 pounds per square inch, this 0317, this experimental R&D glass, could take 100,000 pounds of glass. In other words, it was some strong glass, right? Some very strong glass. So Corning thought they had a hit on their hands, and they went out to commercialize it. One of the places they thought this very strong glass would be applicable was in automobiles, right, on windshields and the like. So they went and did all this testing. What they learned very quickly was that the glass would not break, but the human beings hitting it would. So that kind of didn't go anywhere. But they tried to continue to commercialize this, until about 9 years later, frankly, they gave up. And they took 0317 as it stood at that point and just put it on a shelf. And there it sat. And it sat on that shelf from 1971 until 2007, when this man walked into the corner office of Corning's CEO, Wendell Weeks, who is still Corning's CEO. And he said, "Hey, Wendell, I want you to make me millions of square feet of something that doesn't exist yet. This ultra strong, ultra thin glass that I need for something I won't tell you about." He was perhaps a little bit more disparaging than that. But he told Wendell that this is what he needed. And without knowing how he'd do it, maybe he had a secret plan, who knows, Wendell agreed. Maybe he was just intimidated because Steve Jobs was in his office. And he said, "Okay, sure." So they took Project 0317, they revived it, they renamed it Gorilla Glass, and by May 2007, 3 months after Jobs made his demands, they had created enough Gorilla Glass to span about 7 football fields. You all probably know what happened after that. In June of 2007, this material was on the first iPhone, which arguably is one of the devices that has triggered the whole reason why Pinterest now has 80% mobile traffic. Now, that was really just the start of it. That number, 7 football fields, just pales in comparison to where Gorilla Glass is today. Today, Gorilla Glass is on 3 billion consumer devices. That includes everything from TVs, to tablets, to smartphones, to wearables. That number is expected to continue to double as we move forward. And Corning provides this really interesting stat that an analyst called Benedict Evans turned me on to, which is worldwide LCD sales by square foot. They report how much LCD screen was sold per square foot per year. And one thing to note is that it has been going up pretty substantially, reaching about 3.7 billion square feet of LCD screens sold last year. To contextualize that for you and really explain what we're dealing with, that is half a square foot of screen for every single human being on the planet each year. Half a square foot of screen for every human being on the planet sold each year. And we're repeating this year after year after year. So that is a lot of screens. And we're not just talking about glass. For the purpose of our conversation here, we're talking about what's behind it. Apple makes a lot of those 3 billion screens with Gorilla Glass. And as Tim Cook points out, they understand that they should really care about that glass, about that screen, because it's this window to the software. In our case, it's also a window to the web and to the internet, and all the stuff that I have spent so many years of my life tweaking and tuning. And hopefully all of you have spent time building or designing or working on. So in this world of glass, right, online time is essentially screen time. People touch, see, and even hear software through this medium of the glass. So as people who make software, people who make websites, people who make apps, as people who make things that run on all those things, we kind of need an intimate knowledge of screens. This is our medium. This is the thing that we work with to deliver all the great content, the pins, the intent of the pins, and all the other fun stuff we talked about at the beginning, right? It's all happening through this medium. And I'll be the first to say, it's kind of crazy right now. CES is this big show that happens in January of every year. This year at CES, a bunch of smartphones were announced. But when you look at the variety of these smartphones, you have things that run at 577 pixels per inch, have a rounded curved edge for God knows what reason. To put that into perspective, the Apple iPhone, when it came out with iPhone 4, remember Retina Vision, Retina Apocalypse, Retinageddon? Is this ringing any bells? That was 326 pixels per inch, because the human eye cannot detect a pixel at that resolution. What kind of eyes is Samsung designing for now, right? And then you have this super high-end phone. At the same time, Firefox releases their OS on a little smartphone that runs 164 pixels per inch and has the same resolution as the original iPhone that came out in 2007. But if it was just these phones we had to deal with, things wouldn't be so bad. All this stuff also came out at CES. Little computers and screens that you can sort of wear like jewelry. Or what about these kinds of screens? Things that you literally slap on top of your face and you measure in terms of frames per second. and how many different displays they support. Really quickly, your head can start spinning when you consider just in a month, you've got all these varieties of form factors, all these different ways for people to access software. And you start to think, well, how can I actually even cope with this environment? But we don't all have to be experts in every single kind of screen. And so just to sort of ground us into reality for half a second, I want to show you a curve that I've been showing for quite a while, which I think is pretty illustrative of the big picture. This line right here is the growth of global sales of personal computers. Doesn't look that impressive, does it? All of the things that have supported my career and many of yours in this room grew up on this line. The Googles of the world, the Yahoos of the world, the AOLs of this world, the Facebooks of this world, even Pinterest began as a desktop destination. They were all built on the back of this line of people having a computer that they can use to go online with. Now let me draw you another line. That is the smartphones and tablets line. And I like this curve because I think it really illustrates just what kind of a big deal we're talking about here, right? We're talking about a technology that now reaches every human on this rock that spins around our star. That is scale we've never had before. And when you look at this curve, it becomes pretty self-evident that maybe we should be focusing our priorities in a particular place. So let's dissect this line for a second, this smartphones and tablets line. And if we look at kind of the common devices we heard about a minute ago, and we'll just sort of spread out the smartphone and tablet thing. By the way, I just want to do that again because look, I can do that and it works. And I've timed it to do that, so I can just do it. You guys are still here? That's cool. So let's look at what's happening in that smartphones and tablets line, right? Flurry, which supplies analytics for billions of these devices, has chalked this stuff up. And a little while ago, about a year and a half ago, they dissected this line. And they looked at small smartphones, medium-sized smartphones, phablets. Have we abandoned that term yet? I hope that term is dead. Does anybody still use that? Okay. Just kidding. You can stay. Just this once. Small tablets, full-size tablets. Right? They sort of broke it down this way. And they looked at device models. And they saw when they looked at device models, there was a decent number of small-sized smartphones, a very large amount of medium-sized smartphones. It's like some marketing guy that invented the term phablet tweeting at me, like, come on, he's not replying. But you can see a lot of activity here. Okay. A lot of activity here in the medium-sized smartphones. But it's not enough to know what kind of devices are out there. We want to know how much they get used. So if you dissect that same data set by active users, what you'll see is small-sized smartphones, which were about 14% or 16% of device models, have dropped in half. In terms of active users, they don't get used very much. Medium-sized smartphones jumped up to 72%, and full-size tablets jumped up as well. If you look at user sessions, how much do they get used? Same story. Small-sized smartphones drop even more, medium-sized smartphones grow even further, and the rest stays relatively the same. So while there's still a lot of these old crufty devices out there, they don't really get used a lot, which you probably knew. But the more impressive thing is really that 3 to 5 inch medium-sized smartphone range. It's pretty darn important. It gets a lot of users, it gets a lot of activity. And you may be saying, well, what about things like the iPhone 6 Plus? This data is a year and a half old. Yes, it is. So let's look at that. Because in general, what has been happening with phones is they have been embiggering. From the 2007 era of 3.5 inches, then you had things like the Note 2, which was shockingly large, if you guys recall, at about 5.5 inches. Now the average size of a smartphone is close to 5 inches. And if you look at traffic, you can see that these larger size phones at the middle part of last year were starting to take some traffic away from the smaller size phones. So you get more in between 4 and 6 inches. Looking globally at about a 5 billion usage set of page impressions on the web, what you can see in the United States, we're pretty much, okay, don't turn around. What you can see is we're pretty much dominated by 4 to 5 inch devices. Story's a little bit different in Europe, but both basically the same. Asia, it's a little bit more spread out, and then South America, Africa, and Oceania have their own little take on this as well. But when you boil all this stuff down, pretty much across the board, between 4 and 5.5 inches is the sweet spot for the mobile device right now. Looking at that same data set of about 5.2 billion sample size, we also see something else interesting, which is how do people use these devices? And about 94% of the time, they're using them in portrait mode, and only about 6% of the time in landscape mode. Last but not least, another thing we could look at is how are they actually holding these things ergonomically, right? What is the body's position to these devices? My friend Stephen Huber, God bless him, went and observed something like 1,100 people using smartphones in the wild and meticulously wrote down everything they did. Like I said, God bless him for doing that. He found half the time people had a thumb on their screen. About 36% of the time they needed another finger to get done what they were trying to do. And about 15% of the time is what we call the crackberry prayer. Now, if you take that 36% of two-handed use and you dissect it a bit further, what you actually find is, in many cases, people are resorting to grabbing the top of their phone with another hand so they have a little stability and they can actually reach things. But they're not necessarily changing which digit they're using to interact on the phone with. So 72% of two-handed use looks like this, and 28% looks like this, which means about 3/4 of the time, people are a thumb. So if I were to dissect this line for you really quickly, and I went through this fast because I don't know if this is that important, but it is a great starting point. If I were to dissect this big green line that you all should care about and tell you how you can think of it as a baseline experience, what does that look like? In general, it looks like a 4 to 5.5 inch screen. It's probably in portrait orientation, and it's probably being used in one hand. And you may say, well, why do I care? To illustrate why you should care, I will show you a video that I recorded of a woman on an airplane. Here she is. And you can see she's on an app and she's got that grip, right? She's scrolling, 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 moving her thumb up and down. And then she finds something interesting. She's going to tap it. She's going to tap, tap it. Maybe that one works. Tap, 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 tap. Tap it, 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 tap it. Ah, hell, back to cat videos. Now, what can you take away from this video other than Luke's a stalker? You can take away from this video, this is the reality of how people interact with software, right? They got these devices in their hand, they're about yay big, they're using their thumb to try and make their way through it. This kind of quick flicking, scrolling gesture, very dominant. If you make your touch targets too small, if you essentially treat them as web links and text, which a certain blue app that a lot of people use still continues to do, then you will find these kind of strange tap behaviors happening. And you won't be able to actually build the right kind of software experience. So this is why I care about understanding the reality of the screen. Right? Because if you understand the reality of the screen, you understand sort of the situation people are in when they try to use our software and our apps. So the growth we've seen in display screens is actually growth in network connectivity. It's not just lots of glass showing up. It's lots of portals into the digital world showing up of varying shapes and sizes. Online time is screen time because those are our windows to the software and to the web. As a result, we need this understanding of our screens. The first part of it is not everything's equal, right? This mobile thing's a big deal. The rest of it is really understanding what our screens can do and what we can do with them. And for that, I want to talk about output, input, and posture. And excuse me for nerding out a little bit about this, but when I go into these details, what I want to illustrate here is when somebody has something like marble and they are a sculptor of marble, the more they understand about how that marble works, the more amazing things they can create, right? If you sort of know how to hit marble to have an effect, if you know how to buff marble, if you know what tool to use on the marble, you can create things that are just amazing. And this is why I want to dig into all these little details of input and output and posture, because it's kind of like the sculptor understanding how to hit a big piece of rock to make a sculpture. We have these screens. What do we do to them to create digital experiences like the ones funding this talk and all the free food and books you got? So let's start with output. as I mentioned before, output is a complicated world, right? Like there are screens of all shapes and sizes able to access software. And we're not just talking about these smartphones and tablets I showed before, but whoosh, this time I carefully kind of, there's this whole range of screen sizes out there. On the web, we've actually gotten pretty good, believe it or not, at dealing with this range. Because what we've developed is this system called responsive web design, which hopefully most of you are familiar with. But what essentially allows you to do is say, hey, make my layout fluid, which is how the web works anyway. It has these innate reflow components. Make the media fluid, so they just sort of stretch to fill the space. It's like pouring water into a glass. Whatever sizes it is, it'll fill. But then we also have this tool called a media query. And the media query is a web-specific bit of technology, but I want to talk about it in the context of working with screens. Because what the media query says is, hey screen, if you're at least this wide, or at most this wide, I want to change something about how I present my software. Right? At this width, I want to do this. At this width, I want to do this. You're asking the screen for a property of it, and you're adjusting your design as a result of that property. So that kind of layout allows us to deal with varying screen sizes. But there's more than just screen sizes to contend with. That, as Tim Cook continues to say, we care about the display, not just the size, but also the resolution, the clarity, and he lists a whole bunch of aspects of output that matter to him. So if we dissect just a couple of these, let me look at a few. Just a few years ago, all these kinds of devices had about 100 pixels per inch in terms of resolution. It's like 199, 106, something like that. Still very common. Along came smartphones that essentially doubled that. We had close to 200 pixels per inch. Then the Retina apocalypse hit, right? 326 pixels per inch. This is the Samsung Galaxy S4, 441 pixels per inch. Really introduced 1080p to this tiny screen. This is one of my favorites just because of its name, the LG Optimus Quad HD. I think I had this character in the 80s when I played with Transformers a lot. But he is 538 pixels per inch. Just to put this in the context, that is a 5-inch screen that holds as many pixels as the 27-inch monitor cinema display you see across this building right now. And I think this is really underappreciated. When most designers or engineers talk about Retina graphics, they're like, oh crap, I gotta make a 2x version of this. Oh God, they're going to make me make a 4x version next. It's like a chore. It's this burden somebody has put on you. Dude, you got a 27-inch monitor in the palm of your hand. Right? This is transformative stuff. This isn't a burden. This is a huge opportunity to take advantage of these capabilities. And this trend is going nowhere because now you've got things like Ultra HD. Pseudo 4K. This is a Dell monitor, 28-inch Dell monitor, 3,840 by 2,160. Costs about $700. And then, of course, Apple has to come up with their own name for the thing, so they make this 5K Retina thing, which is 5,000 by 3,000 pixels wide. It's a heck of a lot of pixels. And you may say, well, who cares? Well, let's look at this progression for just half a second, right? We started out with standard definition, then we moved to HD, now we moved to full HD, now we're in Ultra HD, then we got 4K, then we got 5K on top of that. So anybody that's moved to, you guys have any of you looked like an older generation device and you can see the pixels and your mind's kind of blown? Like, is this a Game Boy? What am I looking at here? Why can't I see these blocks? It just feels wrong, right? So this is generally a good thing. However, as Dave Rupert aptly pointed out, more pixels can equal more problems. And here's why. If you're dealing with like that Dell monitor, I'm not even going to talk about the 5K thing, and you've got about 4,000 pixels, you put a full bleed image on there, it's about 10 megabytes worth of size. That is enough to choke a typical mobile browser. It will gag on a 2 megabyte image, right? Much less a 10 megabyte image. And then you say, well, Luke, it's not like anybody would ever put a full bleed image on a web page or an app, right? How about every freaking person does this? Find me one that does not have giant, massive, full bleed image. I always have these debates with the design team. I'm like, it looks good because you put a giant honking image on it. Everything looks good with a giant honking photo behind it. right? Sort of like the design trick 101. Photo. Happens. So, first lesson in our impending sort of high-res doom is try to avoid full bleed images. There's lots of different ways to do this, but this is a big transition because we kind of have to move away from things just being images and trying to think about things being math. CSS, web type, SVG, picture fill, all this good stuff. But I'm not going to deal with all these things right now. What I want to point out instead is that same little thing that I showed you at the beginning, the media query, also can ask the screen for another property. It can ask the screen, are you high resolution? What level of resolution are you? And again, based on what the screen tells you, you can adjust your design. You can say, oh, for high resolution, use this. For lower resolution, use that. In the case of very high resolution, use this. So again, what we find ourselves doing here is actually creating a rule set for our experiences. We look at the screen, we get a property back, and we tell it how to adapt to the result it gets, whether it's width or whether it's resolution. And I'll come back to this again in a second. Because the other thing that this trend has done is it's really moved us up the aspect ratio, I don't know, chart, whatever you want to call this, right? But we're getting into more and more widescreen experiences. The reason for this is pretty obvious. In the United States, or actually in all of North America, 50% of downstream traffic is Netflix and YouTube, aka video media formatting. So every device manufacturer knows this, right? And they go and make things so that you can actually view video on it. As a result, even back in 2013, the top selling smartphones in the US were all 16:9 aspect ratio. This isn't just a TV thing, this is affecting every single device because of what people do on these computers. So what does it mean when you have this widescreen aspect ratio? Well, here's a Microsoft Surface tablet, and if you take this page and you just flip it like this, you kind of got to do some adjustment to make it useful. In fact, you can see the impact aspect ratio has on a design. When something's really long and short, you got to think about the space differently than when something's really tall but narrow. And unlike smartphones, when you look at tablets, it's pretty much a 50-50 split. All the data I see basically says people use landscape and portrait roughly the same. So roughly 50-50 things. So you got to think about both. In fact, you can go look at a lot of interesting data that shows the bigger the screen gets, the more landscape use happens. It's a pretty consistent pattern. So if we start out in something like portrait, you've got this vertical orientation, what happens when we shift it into landscape? Trent Walton wrote about this a little bit ago, and he was doing this thing, like if the screen got big, he made the fonts bigger so you could view stuff more. And he was using a combination of two media queries there to make an additional adjustment. So he was looking at the width, but he was also looking at the height. He said, hey screen, how tall are you? Because what he did was if somebody shifted it like this and all of a sudden his font size put very little content on the screen, what he did was he said, okay, don't increase that font size if the screen is not tall enough for it to make sense. So he is essentially suppressing bad things from happening, right? Just allowing you to read like 3 lines of text on horizontal view. But you can use the same methodology to make good things happen. And I'll just show you 2 simple examples and then we'll do something a bit more complex. So here's one. As you get more into a shorter screen, what we're going to do is just take away some of that padding, as you can see. And then we'll open it up when we got more screen space. Or if we've got a very important call to action, like which Paris girl are you, we can just kind of make sure it's visible. Right? There it is. And then we get more room, we'll move it down, no problem. You can still get started. It's not an issue. So very simply, just sort of padding stuff up. And I love this kind of methodology because if anybody asks you, well, where's the fold? You can be like, well, where do you think the fold is? We need the call to action above the fold. Okay, which fold are we talking about, huh? You like this fold? You like that fold? I had too many bad meetings with Brand. There's a call to action. It's not freaking here. It's a giant button. We did an A/B test that the red one is better. Okay, fine, I'll make it red. Take me out back. Am I the only one who has this kind of life? You guys all sound like it's like not a big deal, right? Anywho, you can have your little call to action above the fold. It's all good. Don't get me started on the fold. Anyhow, so in the case of a wide or short screen, we can tighten stuff up. That's a pretty cool technique. We can also move important things up to make sure they're visible and the like. So when we have this orientation, again, it's a rules-based kind of system, right? In this sort of aspect ratio, let's react to the property of the screen with our design. What happens when the opposite is true? So here now we're going to move from these simple Paris Girl quizzes, which are actually very deep and complex. We're going to move from that example to a web app. And in the web app, we've got a map, we've got all this nav, we have all these features and functions. And in landscape mode, everything's good. You can interact with these things on the side in these comfortable to hit areas. You've got a big bit of content. And then you go and do this, and oh, our beautiful map has become a tiny sliver. The menus are now these huge honking things. So what do? Well, we can take the menu and slide it over to the right. Well, now we've mushed two different kinds of menus together, so maybe that's not so great. We can maybe take that menu and put it off canvas because it's very secondary. It's just this top level thing. Make sure there's clear access to it. We can keep the menu on the right consistent, or we can take that menu and flip it over to the bottom where it's, again, a little bit more convenient for people when they're holding these screens in their hands to interact. And we've made a couple adjustments to deal with this tall and narrow case. We made use of off-canvas design patterns. We repositioned things towards the bottom of the screen. But you get the idea, right? These are simple examples. This one's a little bit more complicated. We're reacting to the properties of our medium, to the properties of screens. So that's the output side of the coin. And we want to make sure our software displays in the best way possible. So we got to deal with things like widescreen aspect ratios, high resolution, varying screen sizes, and all these things. And there's this really cool methodology which says, screen, tell me something about yourself. Based on the result, I'm going to put in a couple different rules for my design to adapt. If input is what we get out of our screens, input is what we put, if output is what we get out of our screens, input is what we put into our screens. And I've quoted Tim Cook a few times, so in order to be really fair, I'm going to shift over to the Windows side of the coin. And to the former head of Windows, this is Mr. Steven Sinofsky. Don't ask me what all the children are doing around him, but there they are. And Steven has this really great quote, any piece of glass you can't touch and interact with will feel broken. And to illustrate what he means by this, we can look at the same chart in growth of screens by growth of touch screens. Right? It's the exact same trend we saw with screens. Not only are all these screens coming out, they're increasingly things you can touch and interact with. Now, the story with input is actually much more complicated than this. While you can say, oh yeah, an iPad, that's a multi-touch device. Somebody could very easily slap a keyboard onto it. And by default, it comes with a front-facing camera, a gyroscope, voice, magnetometer, GPS, microphone, accelerometer, camera, and Bluetooth LTE to connect it to other kinds of devices. Looking at a similar kind of device, but from the Microsoft camp, you've got multi-touch, you've got a pen in the form of a stylus, you've got a cursor from a trackpad, you've got a keyboard. These aren't just these weird lablet, tab-top, hybrid, ultrabook, convertible devices we're talking about. There's also just run-of-the-mill Android phones that have multi-touch, a cursor from a trackball, and a keyboard attached. And if you really want to be a geek, you can make this crazy chart like I did, which looks at all the different input types across the form factors that Apple has released for their primary devices, the watch, the phone, the tablet, the laptop, the desktop. And in terms of input, that is so cool. I don't know how that happens, but it's great. Multi-touch, force touch, keyboard, cursor, back camera, front camera, Bluetooth, GPS, barometer, NFC, accelerometer, gyroscope, light sensor, digital compass, proximity sensor, microphone, heart rate sensor, and digital crown. So like, how do you design for this? It was bad enough you had like 100 different screens to deal with of varying shapes and sizes and resolutions and aspect ratios and all these things, right? How do you cope with that? And now, I mean, first of all, that's like mock-up hell, right? Can we get a mock-up for the landscape view of the 240 pixel Android device running gingerbread? Actually doesn't have an API to support the accelerometer, so. Yeah. So the reaction to a lot of this stuff has been, well, can't we just figure out what kind of input's there and change the UI? This is what everybody tried to do at the beginning of the day. They're like, oh, cool, yeah, we'll just make like a touch-based UI, and we'll just make a cursor and keyboard UI. And that was Windows 8, if anybody remembers. Right? That didn't exactly work out so well. It doesn't really work out very well in other situations as well. But it's a totally reasonable approach. You kind of want to know what input is available, and you want to change the UI as a result of it. In fact, we tried to do this with my last startup. We had this multi-device layout that the mobile experience, when you're on a small screen, it totally worked for this 4.5 to 5 inch, one-handed, one thumb kind of interaction. Really easy to scroll, core actions dead center, and you can interact with it. But when somebody expanded this UI to a much larger device form factor, and in fact, when they expanded it to one that had a keyboard, we wanted to continue that speed of use, that level of quick interaction. So we said, oh, cool, well, if they got a keyboard, let's show them this little tip that tells them they can move up, down, left, right, and vote using a keyboard command. So if keyboard, tell them they can use keyboard to be just as fast as they were with that one thumb kind of interaction. Because keyboard things tend to be pretty invisible. People don't know they're there. And you're like, okay, cool, well, that's easy. Let's just figure out if this thing has touch. And in some cases, you're going to be right, and in some cases, you're going to be wrong. At the end of the day, you're going to pull your hair out. And what you'll find is you'll sort of end up in this moment of zen where you just decide, you know what? Let's just support it all. And at first, it sounds crazy. You say, I'm just going to support all those input types. Sounds crazy, but actually, this is what we do. So when you're in a small size screen factor, small screen form factor, you can use multi-touch gestures, and you can use drag and you can swipe to move these things around in this image editor, and then you can use pinch and zoom to resize the thing and adjust those images to whatever you want. Those touch interactions work across every single screen size, so you can still use all those good touch gestures on this kind of size or on this kind of size or on this kind of size. But when we hit a certain screen size threshold, we actually let you know you can do things with the mouse. So you can use a little scroll wheel or a trackball to move things to zoom. You can double click to snap things into place, right? And we surface this stuff through these two little tips that tell you double click to fit, scroll to zoom. Again, these things would be hidden. Now here's the kicker. In here, we make a pretty bad assumption because we say when you're on a smaller size screen, it's more likely to be touch. When you're on a bigger size screen, there's more likely to be a keyboard and a cursor. So we're using screen size as a proxy for input, which you can really quickly understand how this would fail if you're doing things like voice and the like. Screen size is not a good proxy for input, but frankly, it's all we have right now on the web. Luckily, there's these new kinds of media queries coming out. One, which is the pointer. What kind of input is being used? Is it a coarse? Is it a fine piece of input? Hover. Is the hover pseudoclass? Is hover capable on this device? And you can do things like if the input cursor is coarse, it's like a finger, then you can adjust your UI again. So using the same methodology of screen, tell me something about your property, in this case the input that it supports, you can make adjustments. It's more of this rule-based stuff. So with input, supporting all the inputs may seem crazy, but it's totally doable and it's actually freeing. It's a zen kind of moment when you hit that state. But you probably want to do some things to communicate what's possible. Right now, we tend to proxy that through screen size on the web. We can do better on native, but I hope in the future we'll have better tools like that media query 4 stuff. So, input is what we put into screens. Output is what we get out of them. What is this posture thing? Well, posture is how people interact with output and input. Because at the end of the day, we're not designing for screens, right? Sculptures aren't made for marble. They're made for people. Just like software isn't made for screens, it's made for people. So we have to understand how people interact with the output and input of our systems to make sure that they can actually do what they're trying to do. And to talk about this, I'm going to turn it back over to Netflix. I mentioned that they're responsible for 50% of downstream traffic in North America, along with YouTube. And how do they do that? How do they support this wide range of devices, of all these different things that allow you to view Netflix? Well, it turns out math has something to do with it. In fact, they employ this really tall guy called 10-foot user interface guy. And there's also 2-foot user interface guy, an 18-inch user interface guy. I didn't make up this joke. But they're not actually talking about the height of these people. They're talking about viewing distance. Right? And 10-foot UI guy's job is to figure out how to design the 10-foot away viewing experience, the most common viewing distance for a TV-size screen. Now, let me explain what's going on here. So Netflix runs on a whole bunch of different devices. Right? If you break down where people watch Netflix, the list goes on and on and on. 44% will watch it on a laptop, 15% on a Blu-ray player, 12% on a PS3, 10% on Xbox 360. There's like 500 different SKUs that they're available on. And if you try to design for 500 separate devices one at a time, right, you will go crazy. That is just way too many screens to manage. However, if instead you look at this through a human factors lens, you can do this. 83% of people have a 10-foot away viewing experience. 44% have a 2-foot away viewing experience. 23% have 1 foot. 15% have a 1.5 feet. And this is what we're talking about with posture, right? How people interact with the input and output. So you can go from a list of 500 things down to 4. And that 4 becomes very manageable. A 12-inch viewing experience is what you typically find on a smartphone. This is the average viewing distance for a handheld device of roughly the 4 to 5 inch range. And in this 12-inch viewing, if you look at the browse screen of Netflix, if you look at this box view layout, those boxes are sized at 1 inch. We're talking about physical dimensions here because we're talking about people, right? How our bodies interact with the screen. It's sized at about 1 inch. At 18 inches, it's at 1.75. Same kind of layout, but resized differently. Typical laptop, desktop viewing distance, about 24 inches. It's 2.25. And if you go to the 10-foot experience, that same layout on that device is 5.25 inches. If you break this down into a math formula, it kind of looks something like this. And by the way, I have to say, I was really looking for a magic formula here because I had heard the Silicon Valley legend or lore where Neil Hunt, who's the CPO over at Netflix, he went into this thing that is called a video store. See what I'm talking about? Okay, nobody knows. So it's this room where they put up like plastic boxes of movies, and you could ask for another plastic box which had like tape inside it? No? Okay. But anyway, what you do in this thing is you could stand and see the movies in front of you arranged. And so the Silicon Valley lore says he went into this video store and he measured how far away he was in the size of the box to determine what was viewable. Maybe Kent knows if this is true. Is this true or not? It's not true. Okay. It sounds really cool. It sounds like a really cool legend. So Neil did nothing like this. No, anyway. I was looking for this formula, and it turns out the math doesn't exactly work out. But there's something to this, right? If you fudge the numbers a little bit, it's about 0.5 inch per foot of managing viewing distance. And this isn't a new idea. If you go and look at people who deal with physical environments, like signage in the London Underground system, they for years have had guidelines which say, depending on how far away the sign is, the font size needs to be bigger. Right? You've always had this sort of orientation. And the reason why this is important is if you just look at the output capabilities of a device, if you just look at how many pixels are on a 50-inch HD TV, you will find it's the same number of pixels that are on a Galaxy S4 5-inch screen. But people are viewing this 10 feet away and viewing this 1 foot away. And so what are you going to do? Serve the same UI? We did a project with Microsoft at the last startup on doing something for Xbox One where we actually rendered this web experience on the Xbox One, and both of these things actually used the same device width. They both told the browser they're about 320 pixels wide. But as you can clearly see, probably putting your mobile website up on a TV 10 feet away is not a good idea. Because you want to instead design for a 10-foot away viewing experience, as you can see in our final iteration versus a 1 foot away experience. And this isn't just stuff related to TVs, this is stuff related to heads-up displays. Glass is a heads-up display that actually has a web browser and it runs apps. And looking at glass, when you put it on, everybody expects this immersive 3D thing. It's nothing like that. It's literally a screen right here in your peripheral vision that is the equivalent of looking at a 25-inch HD screen 8 feet away. It actually is about 640 and 360 pixels. If you go and browse a website on it, which you can, it has a default dynamic viewport, and it'll take something like Yahoo Finance and make it look like that. So if you're looking up financial information, this is what you see on the postage-sized screen 8 feet away. Good? Okay, cool. Let's use responsive web design. Well, it has a dynamic viewport of... This is what financial information looks like on glass in glassware cards. This is what Wikipedia looks like. This is what ESPN looks like. It's much more like a dashboard kind of screen, like what you'd expect for a monitor hanging on the wall that's giving you some data, right? That you kind of just check in on like this. And I bring this stuff up because I think this is an increasingly important thing to do. I've talked a little bit about how this works on the web, but as of, 3 weeks ago, Microsoft revealed their Windows Universal Platform apps, WUP. I think it's called WUP, or WUPU. Does anybody know the acronym? Windows Universal Platform? I think it's WUP. No one cares. Okay. Anywho, what you do when you build these Windows Universal apps is they will actually allow you to build an interface that scales across different viewing distances. So you define some basic parameters and it takes into account viewing density, or viewing distance and screen density, and optimizes for perceived sight. So you size. So you set up a UI element and it'll automatically scale it to look the right way when you render on these different devices. So these concepts which were sort of kicking off on the web are now being embedded into core native apps. And I suspect the other players, the Androids and the iOSs of the world, will not have a choice but to adapt to some of these principles, right? They sort of have to. There's too much variety in screens. And frankly, the burden on every single one of us is a little bit too great to do all this work. Because when it comes to posture, we don't have to just deal with viewing distance. We also have to deal with things like the size of our hands and how we hold devices. I talked a little bit about how smartphones get held. You can do similar exercises on laptops that have touch. You can do similar exercises on tablets. In fact, in Windows 8, Microsoft designed their application controls to be in the bottom right corners of the screen. When you interact with an app, they put persistent commands over here, distinct commands over here, and they did this so these things are more ergonomically accessible. If any of you have moved from a 3-inch-ish phone to a 5-inch-ish plus phone, you're probably familiar with the notion that it is hard to reach things. Does this happen to anybody? Right, you're kind of like, ah! Our children will have these really long thumbs. People will not know why. It's super easy to hitchhike, right? So you've got this comfortable one-handed grip, and the way we do UI doesn't necessarily account for where comfortable and easy to hit is and where ouchie zones are. Especially as you increase in screen size, you can see the ouchie zones grow. So there's ways we can adjust our software as well. We can put menu controls in the bottom corners. We can put the most commonly used options on the bottom of the screen. Heresy, I know. Did I just suggest you reverse sort a menu? Sorry. Floating menu controls. You can do things like this out of the Android material design guidelines. And you can start to see apps that account for this. So this is a Swarm before. You can see the primary action of checking in was in the upper right-hand corner. In their recent redesign, it's bottom center in that much more comfortable to hit zone. So the posture of our hands and how they interact with our bodies is another element to consider. And last but not least, on the posture side, I talked about the 10 feet away viewing experience. But you also have environmental conditions. When you start to talk about how people interact with these screens, they may be in a position of low light or other environmental factors. I use low light because there's very obvious examples to this. All of your Maps apps on your phones do this now. During the day, they look like this. During the night, they auto-magically change like this. uses the ambient light sensor and just changes the presentation of the UI to make things more readable. You can do this on your own in your apps if you like. And believe it or not, that same methodology that I talked about before, that media query in level 4 has something called light level, where it'll tell you, is it washed out, is it dark, is it light, and you can adjust again. So, posture, here we're dealing with the size of humans and their environments. And to wrap all this up, let me kind of give you the 1, 2, 3, 4. We're entering this world of glass, right? Where online time is screen time. We need to understand as much of our screens as possible so that we can create the right kind of experience. While there's tons of different screens out there, the mobile one is still pretty darn important. So I think it's a good baseline. It's a great place to start. We have various aspects of output to consider. High resolution, widescreen, and great tools like responsive design, and increasingly in native platforms, similar tools. Input, we've got to deal with various kinds of inputs. We can manage that a little bit. And posture, we've got viewing distance and environment. And again, I keep bringing up media queries because I like to think there can be a methodology for this. I like to think that you can build a design system which looks at the screen and so asks it a series of questions, and then you have if-then statements almost, right? If this wide, do this with design. If high resolution, do this with the design. And you start to build a rules-based engine for an interface, as opposed to building these one-off mock-ups for every single screen size and form factor, which we all know is not really sustainable. Right? It's almost like UI design is art direction. You impose a series of rules and adjustments to account for this variety. And frankly, I don't know about you guys, but that sounds pretty darn cool to me. And perhaps inevitable in some ways. But to be fair, I'm going to close with Mr. Steven Stanofsky again, because he asked a really interesting question that I think is worth talking about. I've talked about the rise of glass and how everything is screen time. But he asked, what's the disruption of screens? What's coming next? What should we be prepared for? Is it going to be some other kind of material, like sapphire? If you read Corning's press releases, they're scared to death of sapphire. They release all these like proactive things that say, Gorilla Glass is 10 times harder than sapphire. We tested it, we know. So they're scared to death of it. What about voice interfaces? Maybe we don't even need screens. Maybe we can just talk to stuff. I think there's a lot of good happening in voice, but all of you cannot be checking your Facebook feeds while I talk using your voice. So some of the applications are a little bit more limited, and we'll still need to see things and interact with it. What about wearables? This is certainly a hot topic right now, and so I'll spend a moment on that. I think the interesting thing about wearables is, are they going to complement or disrupt this line? That is, will usage of wearables and embedded sort of screens and computers drive more use of smartphones or less? Are they going to complement or disrupt this line? And the reason why I think this is an interesting question worth asking is because when we went from desk and lap size screen down to palm size screens, this is what happened to time spent. And at the time when mobile devices came out, very few people were willing to say, oh yeah, desktop's just going to tank, everything's going to go to mobile, right? And everyone instead was like, no one's going to ever do blank on mobile. No one's going to ever watch TV shows on mobile. No one's ever going to buy anything on mobile. No one's ever going to pin to their pin board a fantastically Pinteresting post on mobile. Did I get that right? I think I did. So the interesting question is, what happens when you go from palm-sized to wrist-sized devices? How does that dynamic change, right? And I think it's interesting for this reason, but it's also when I took a look at what my day looks like with digital devices, I found I sort of wake up, and there's my phone, and I'm going to check, make sure nothing blew up at night, right? You check your email, you look at all the other things. How many likes on Instagram did I get? 9, delete, it hasn't hit 11 yet. You laugh because you all do it. And then, whatever kind of commute you have, you listen to your podcasts, you read things. So maybe this is increasingly happening in car dashes. Then you're at work, you got a big screen monitor for doing some stuff. You're carting around the laptop. You still always have your phone with you. Back in the commute, you're either on the tablet or the whatever, or the in-car dash. Then you come home at night, you can watch something. It's probably a connected screen. If you play a game, it's definitely connected. Maybe in the evening you read something on a tablet thing on the couch. Maybe that's your deal. Back to bed to check all the emails. Did you get 11 likes? Yes or no? Okay, you did. Fine. Go to bed. And so you're bouncing between all these different screens of shapes and sizes. But the one screen that's always visible and always on is the screen that's kind of on your body. And I don't know if we have reached the potential of this yet. I actually don't believe we have. But I think there's something very interesting about digital information that I can just go like this and that for. So we'll see where that goes. Coming back to disruption, Corning, for one, is not sitting still. They've continued to invest in R&D, and they have a new R&D project that has developed this thing they call Willow Glass. It is ultra thin and ultra light. In fact, it's so flexible that you can bend it almost 180 degrees, as shown in this image, and it's thinner than a dollar bill. Super thin, super bendable, super light glass. They think Willow is going to be their entry into what they call the flexible displays market, which is expected to reach nearly 800 million units in 2020. So until then, Wendell Weeks is still sitting in that same corner office that Steve Jobs walked into, kind of waiting for someone to tell him what to do with this stuff. Steve's not around anymore. Rest in peace. Maybe it'll be one of you that goes in and tells Wendell what to do. But whatever ends up happening, I think there's some pretty exciting stuff coming down the pipe in our world of screens. So that's what I wanted to talk to you guys about. Hopefully you find some of it as interesting as I do. And thank you very much. I don't know the format. Do I have time for questions, or are we shifting to the next talk? I'm out? Okay, I'm out. Thanks, guys.
Well, thanks, Luke. Let's all stand up and take like a second stretch break. We still have 2 more presentations tonight, so these will be a bit shorter. You shouldn't take more than 30 or 40 minutes. All right, cool. Are we ready? So the next talks, so my talk will be about 25 minutes, and then Carl will talk for about 15 minutes. So we should have you out of here by 9. Cool. So let's get started. Settle in. All right, awesome, cool. So my name is Wendy, and I'm an iOS engineer on the product team at Pinterest. And today I'm going to be talking about how Pinterest rebuilt our new user education on mobile. So to get started, let's step back and talk about what I mean by user education. So here are some examples of where we use user education in our app. On the left, you'll see our home feed nag. In the middle, we have what we call our first pin experience that introduces a user and tells them what pinning is and how to pin. And finally, like many other apps, we have our new user education or our new user experience, and this we present to the user right after sign up. I'll go into a bit of detail about all of these later, but what's the motivation behind user education? User education leads to engagement. And we found this to be true both qualitatively and quantitatively through research. So what does that actually mean, right? Engagement is sort of an overused term these days. Namely, we find that a good user education will reinforce cause and effect in the app. So here's an example. This is our first pin education. And basically, we have the user tap the pin it button and pin their first pin onto a board. And this is pretty simple, but we found that this flow actually increases pinning in subsequent days by over 50%. We have many more of these educational components throughout our app, and we plan on adding more and more over time as we expand into new markets or we add new features. Now I'll talk about some of the challenges that we've faced before while building user education. We want to preserve a great user experience. So we know that education works, but as we add more and more of these components, we run the risk of overwhelming the user. So here's an example. So right here we have what's called conflicting education, where the user, there's two pieces of education on the screen at the same time. So we have the home feed nag at the top and the blue tutorial card at the bottom. And this is subtle, but it's not a great user experience because we're sort of bombarding the user with two different messages at the same time. Another problem is cross-platform educational units. So if the user goes through a flow on our mobile app, when they go to the web app, they probably shouldn't see that flow again. And finally, we never want user education to sort of stay on the screen forever. For example, here, if we have a nag and the user never dismisses it or takes action on it, it could just indefinitely stay there. And this is really bad because then the user will just sort of learn to ignore that space at the top of the screen, and it's just wasted real estate for us. Our second problem was targeting. So we only want to show user education to users that actually need it. So we know that new users and our most engaged users tend to invite their friends more. So for this inviter nag, we only want to show that to those groups of people. If you're a new user or if you have an empty home feed, we prompt you to follow some topics to make your feed more personalized. But if you already have a very curated home feed, there's no reason we actually need to show you this piece of education. Also, we want to have rapid experimentation, right? So how do we know which educations to show? Or how do we know if it works? Or which cohorts to target? And how many views of a tutorial is actually the most effective? A/B experimentation can tell us all of these things, but it's traditionally more hard to run on mobile apps because it requires a new release and a new App Store approval. And doing all the things I just mentioned can make the client code very complex, very unwieldy, and our goal is to ideally keep the client code clean as we add more and more user education, and as we add more and more developers to our team as well. Solution. The Experience Framework is something we built in-house, and it's a system that manages all our user educational components in a single place. And it provides these support for this targeting and this experimentation. So the whole idea is that educational components are delivered from the server to the client at runtime. I'll explain how it handles things such as conflicting experiences. So basically the idea is that we think of every piece of user education as what we call an experience, and every piece of real estate in our app is a placement. So on our left we have the nag placement, in the middle of the home view placement, and finally the pin view tutorial card placement. And every placement can only hold one experience at any given point in time. So this makes things like conflict resolution really easy. We can also set cooldown periods for placements. So we can say that after a user has seen a piece of education in one placement, we shouldn't show them another piece of education for X number of hours or X number of days. And this doesn't overwhelm the user as much. It provides support for things like targeting. So since all the experiences are delivered from the server to the client at runtime, the client really doesn't need to know what it needs to render, and we can target very specific groups. So on the back end, we can filter by things such as app type and app version, gender, the number of days since sign up, country and language, the number of pins or boards, and historical data, such as how many times the user has pinned. And finally, the client only knows what the back end tells it to render. So this makes experimenting really easy. So we can simply change a string on the back end, and the client will get that. We don't have to go through a new release. This also makes the client code very clean because the client code doesn't contain any of the logic of deciding what to show to a user. So traditionally, something like this, which is a messaging experiment, experimenting with different versions of text, This would require, more client code to be written, a new App Store release, and now it's just a matter of editing a simple config file on our back end. So for the second part of the presentation, I'm just going to go through a couple of deep dives into where we use the Experience Framework in our mobile apps today. So first I'll talk about nags. Nags are important information which we occasionally surface to the top of a user's feed. And they can be anything from a call to action, such as confirm your email, or an announcement, such as you can now discover more pins. And before, our code for these nags was really hairy. We did all of the logic on the client, basically. So we would basically iterate through every single possibility. So we would say, like, did the user confirm their email? Okay, if not, let's show them this nag. Once they act on that, let's wait 24 hours and show them this other nag. So that's not ideal for us. With the Experience Framework, every time we reload the home feed, we simply ask this Experience Framework, what should I show in this nag? What does that data look like? Well, it's just a JSON object with things such as title text, detail text, image URL, button text, and it also has these two things called button1 URL and button2 URL. And those are URLs with the Pinterest scheme, so Pinterest : / that correspond to specific actions in our app. So for example, when the user taps invite friends, we want to present the invite friends controller, the view controller that contains our friend inviter module. And we can do this because all initialization and presentation of view controllers in our app is handled through a centralized navigation manager. And this navigation manager works by taking in a URL of the Pinterest scheme. It then maps that URL to a certain view controller class, and it contains the code to initialize and present that view controller. And this basically just centralizes the code to create and present view controllers. So if you're accessing the same view controller from multiple points in your app, you don't have to rewrite all that code. It also maintains consistency to other platforms for things such as deep linking. So for example, a URL on our web app, the path of that URL should map to the same path as our mobile app URLs. And this allows for the dynamic insertion of nags from the back end without having to do a new release because we don't have to actually write handlers for those buttons. We know that those buttons can be handled by the navigation manager. So in code, this is what it looks like. We get our navigation manager, which is a shared singleton. We call this method handle URL on it and give it our URL Pinterest : / invite _ friends. The navigation manager will then, it contains a mapping of the host of the URL, which is invite _ friends, to a specific view controller class. And once it gets that view controller class, it just calls this protocol method present host on it. And then the view controller contains the code to initialize itself and present itself. So that's it for nags. And for our second case study, I'll talk about what we call guides at Pinterest. Guides are a guided feature education about core components of the app, so core features or new features. Here's an example of one of them. It's our create board guide. So you'll see that we show the user some example boards from real users, and then we finally pop them into the profile where they can access the create board module. And we can experiment with different versions of these guides, so saying, whether one step or two steps or all three steps is the most effective. And we can handle all that on the back end. We can also experiment with targeting and timing. So what's the best time to show this guide? And what's the best, what are the users that if we show this guide, they'll actually be effective? And when doing experiments like this, it's just important to note that it's extremely important to maintain performance and not introduce any added latency, any user-perceived latency to the user. So for example, you can load all your data first, cache that, and then not show these user education pieces until all that's loaded. In cases where you actually do need to synchronously block on a network call, it's important that you set some sort of timeout on the client that afterwards, if you haven't received any data, you just default to the control treatment. And our Experience Framework backend also handles this by setting timeouts for itself. And so that if the call doesn't finish within X number of seconds, it'll just return to us the control treatment. And we've really taken this be fast or fail fast philosophy when building this system. So we've seen a lot of really big gains since we built this experience framework in-house. Firstly, it's a single place in the back end that controls experiences across all platforms. And it can handle things such as user state logic or other complex logic that the client just doesn't know about. We can dynamically trigger the display of content, so we can know which users to target and very granularly tell them when this should be shown. There's conflict resolutions for educations that touch the same views. And finally, we can experiment with different flows, different messaging, different images to really hone in on the most effective variant of something. And all of this is done while keeping fairly simple client code, which is a big win for our growing team. Looking forward, there's still a lot of work that we want to do on this. We want to add automated experimentation systems, so systems that can automatically, increase or decrease group sizes in experiments to ultimately arrive at the winning experience. And we also want to add custom education for specific markets, specific countries, as we expand into new markets and hopefully have Pinterest users all over the world. So that's it for me. Thanks for listening. And next, Carl will be talking about optimizing the Pinner's Android experience.
Okay, is this thing on? Okay. So I'm Carl. I work on the Android team here at Pinterest, and tonight I'm going to give you a sneak peek into sort of how we do what we do on Android. And all this really came out of our value of putting pinners first, and we make good on that promise by ensuring that when we do ship something to them, it's the best it can possibly be. And it actually fulfills our own needs of making the product better and innovate on it and iterate quickly. So I'll touch on three main areas, and they all support this core idea. So first, it's the dreaded P word. Everybody hates this. You either love it or you hate it. But basically, it's really an understanding of how we get things done as a team. And it's not meant to slow you down, but it's meant to reduce the friction of shipping things. It ensures, again, that we ship the best thing possible. Second, don't support every device. Sorry, Luke. And let me say this in context that this is specifically for native Android applications, and I'll explain later. But basically, we have all these questions. My favorite justifying question is, why are we holding back the experience of many for the outdated few? Sometimes you have to optimize through exclusion and then redirection. And lastly, design. So specifically material design. Some of you Android people here have probably experienced this, but we have a design language that's actually really exciting for designers. They finally want to design for it. And material design optimizes the experience through consistency, delight, and actually this interest from designers. So later I'll talk a bit about how we did that for our 4.0 release of the Android app. It's a process. It stirs up so many emotions. These people are obviously excited. Some people, pain. Others, it's kind of rare that you find someone in the middle of the road that doesn't really have a feeling about it. But basically, when done right, it keeps both users and engineers happy. So let's run through what that looks like, actually, from the very beginning. So the team of one. So when I started, I was given a laptop and a desk, and they said, go build this Android app. And the process was something like this. Basically, you write code, you run it, you find the bugs, you fix the bugs. Occasionally, you'll commit to Git or whatever, and maybe once a week, you'll make an APK and then email it around. And then that one person in your office will actually install it for 3 minutes on their old Android phone and then forget it ever existed. It's dead simple, and sometimes it works. I'm sure you've all been there, or you maybe even know someone who does this today at a smaller company. But then, if you're lucky, you'll get a couple more people interested in your app and working with you. So 2 months later, in our case, we hired an Android engineer and a designer, actually. And if you can think back 2-3 years, Android designer, that's crazy, right? But we picked up a few more tools to support this. So consistent coding style is one, crash reporting, bug tracking, formal code reviews, which I was only one person, so you don't need, who else is going to review your code? And then we also had a little bit of onboarding, basically, just to kind of get more people into the flow faster. And these little tweaks actually led to us shipping the first version of the app within 3 months. Okay, so now fast forward a couple of years. That brings us closer to today. And if you're really lucky, your company has grown pretty quickly, and you've added more people. But maybe there's some casual contributors now added to your code base and your team. And they aren't as battle-worn as you. Maybe they don't know all of the annoying little details that come with Android. There's a lot of baggage there and a lot of things that you just build up over time, and you learn how to overcome those. But basically, this is when I personally started to really appreciate these tools because it helps you get things done better and more consistently. So like I kind of alluded to earlier, full disclosure, I was really skeptical until I felt the value of all of these things. So here's some specific automated quality tools. First up is Gradle. It's actually not a quality tool, but it's a build tool. And it's sort of the glue that binds this all together. It makes it really easy to incorporate a bunch of tools at once, and they really ultimately lead to a better product. Nightly builds, number two, it could actually be number one, right? You can do a nightly build, and it actually validates your app at a very basic level. Does it build? If your app compiles, that's like the first step of actually making it work. And then there's these next three. So you've got lint, check style, and find bugs. These are really all kind of in one bucket. They all have their own sort of specialty and strengths and weaknesses out of the box. But basically, they enforce good coding practices. They make code reviews easier. Because you're not checking like, oh, is there a space here? Is the curly brace on this line or that line or whatever? And they catch common bugs, so boxing issues or simple null checks and things like that. And then lastly, we've got testing. This is another pain point for a lot of Android people out there. But basically, it's hard, and it's actually probably 100 times harder after you've built the entire app and you've accumulated this code base that you now have to go and test. This is one of the situations where the Android community has really stepped up, and they've brought most of the great tools into the fold. And hopefully, I/O this year will make that even more formal. And then we've got these more manual quality tools, and these are sort of social or just these things that you sort of evangelize through your team. And one of them is patterns. So how do you do things? Maybe you have your own way to background operations, and you don't want to have async tasks written all over the place. So you enforce this in your code base. You teach people how do you use this utility that's built to basically be a safety net. You don't have to reinvent the wheel every time to just do something in the background. It's a very common thing. Then we've got an OTA system. Over the air basically is this website that you can go to here at Pinterest, and Jenkins builds our app every night, and you can actually build any branch, so you don't have to commit your prototype code into master. And really, this allows anybody at the company, whether you're technical or not, to hit a button, install the app, and then use it side by side with your production version, which is really cool. So it's sort of dog fooding at its finest. Then you've got QA, and people sort of brush this off, and I think this is super important because real people actually use your app every day. Whether you have an in-house QA team, or maybe it's an outsourced QA team, or maybe it's just like your friends and family, and you're emailing them and saying, hey, install this app and try it out, because they're going to do it differently, right? They have a different perspective, maybe a different phone, maybe they have different desires and use cases for your app that you never imagined, and they're going to help you find it much faster than you would by, mashing on the buttons yourself. Stage rollout, if you're, again, an Android person, you're pretty familiar with this, but it basically allows you to release the app in small increments. And the most important thing here is they actually released a freezing feature, which is really cool. So if the world is burning, right, you ship your app and it's like 100% crash rate, even though it's for 5% of people, you can actually freeze it and stop the damage. And then one that I'm actually really excited about, which sounds crazy, you're all going to think I'm weird, but is planning. We ship the app every 3 weeks consistently. And it gives a predictable cycle for people to code and work towards. This includes a code freeze and an integration freeze as well. So it prevents you from doing bad things like dropping 1,000 lines of code the night before you ship. Okay, so legacy. This is not just devices, but it's code and all sorts of other things. But basically, not everybody has a Nexus device. Not everybody updates their phone every 6 months like I do. Changes can be really hard to implement in an existing code base. And this section is really about being prepared for that. Device support is more like a moving window, specifically with native apps on Android. You know, over time you'll add and you'll remove, and maybe your company grows and your needs change, and you'll actually expand in both directions rather than just go towards the latest and greatest. Everybody's familiar with these numbers and graphs, I'm sure, but basically the idea here is move up your Min SDK level. For a long time we supported API level 8, and it was a really kind of bad experience. You know, we thought maybe we'd get more people in and they'd like it, but really it just wasn't that great. And really the best thing for them was to go to the mobile web. We already had a pretty decent mobile website. Why not push them there and they can get something maybe even a little bit better? So really here, the idea is just pick the biggest piece of the pie. And you'll even see this is 15 through 19. This doesn't include Lollipop or anything else like that. And the reason why is because that's where you're going to get your most impact. You can do those nice features, it sort of sprinkles on the top, right? But ultimately, that biggest chunk, 83%, you know, that's probably billions of Android devices, right? If you're really at that level that you need to optimize more, then it's, you know, that's pretty great, actually. And then resources kind of goes along in the same bucket, but basically we pick the top 3 here again. You can see, maybe it's a little small, but it's HX and XX DPIs, and really Android's smart enough to scale up and down. And the reason why we picked 3 is because it keeps it really simple. You get smaller bundles, it's easier for designers, and there's less to keep track of in the long run. So you've got a 3-year-old code base, right? That's kind of where we're at. And you've got so many assets building up over time and all these random things, and it's just nice to know, like, okay, we've got these 3 folders and we're going to focus there, and that's sort of the end of it. Then we got this other idea. So this is more preparing for things to change and sort of the future. Basically creating layers, this idea, you kind of already use it today, I'm sure, when you're looking at utilities or managers or things that you grab from the internet, but basically you call in with one single clean interface and you say, do this thing. That makes it really easy to swap out when you update the code in the future. But magic happens when you actually implement this at your core, at your foundation, right? So we actually do this for a lot of our core libraries where you've got a single interface to JSON. We don't care if it's JSON, and that's actually what we use today, but tomorrow if you want to use Jackson or maybe go back to json.org that ships with Android, we could do that, and no one who actually uses the JSON interface would actually even know. They don't need to know because it just works. They get JSON back, and that's all they care about. So you don't have to go through 10,000 files or whatever the case is and manipulate a single line here and there and worry about the library differences. If you just create this one single layer, you can actually replace large portions of your application in a single place very, very quickly. You can actually A/B test too. So you can say like, okay, how does JSON increase or decrease a metric versus Jackson? So navigation. This is another cool place where we actually implemented this. We've abstracted away the idea of navigation. So there's no start activity in our application. There's no fragment transaction or anything like that. We just pass around these navigation objects. And you can see there, there's a location, there's a display mode, and a bundle. The bundle is just like random data that you might need to start up the screen. Display mode is how do you actually want to show it? Is it dialogue? Is it a modal? Whatever little display modes that we actually have. And then there's location. And location is really just an enum, and that maps to fragments in this case. It can map to anything, but basically, it's this idea that you have yet another opportunity to replace that. So if you want people on a certain version of Android to get a certain modified version of home fragment, you could do that. You could swap it out to new home fragment or whatever. Or you can A/B test, see what they like, see what works better. But when you actually want to go somewhere in the actual client code, this is what it looks like. So you do events. We use Event Bus to actually do this. So we actually post a navigation object, which has the location user, and it has some user ID. And then it will actually call all the way up to the top of the app, and it's actually handled at the very top. So we use a view pager actually to show you screens. As the screens slide in and you can swipe them away, that's actually a view pager that controls almost our entire application. And here you can see we just take that event and push it into there, and basically it notifies data set change and your adapter rebuilds itself and all that sort of stuff. But we can also handle fragments as well. Just a plain old fragment with a fragment transaction, pretty standard code. But the cool thing is you can swap this out in the future. So in a year or 2 or 3 or 4 or whenever Google releases something new, like a fragment successor, we can actually switch to that without, again, going through all these lines of code and replacing it. No one needs to know in reality that you've actually changed it, because you changed it in one place and everything fell in line. So design and material design specifically. App Compat was a good start, but there's still a lot of stuff that's missing. There's the guidelines, which are great. They give you a pretty clear idea of what you need to do, but how you do it is a little different. The community, again, has stepped in to fill that gap, but even still, there's stuff left over, Here's an example of our sort of latest redesign of our app that we shipped a few months ago. So this is Toolbar, but one of the interesting things about Toolbar is there's no drop shadow support for older phones. And by older, I mean like the lower versions. And maybe that's changed, right? I don't know, but at least when we were doing our version of the app, we actually had to build our own. So we just took a view group and put your toolbar in there and put your shadow below, and we have our interface to get to it. And when it does change, we can actually swap it out very easily. We've got rounding. This one's kind of a pain too, but you can see we've got a bunch of rounding in our app here, or I guess I should point over here. We round the entire application, we round each grid cell, we round the little board representation there, and they're all done in slightly different ways. At the very basic level, you can do masking, right? You take a semi-transparent image with opaque little corners, and it knocks out your image. It's kind of simple and old school and ugly, but it works, and it's really low cost to everybody involved. You can also do paint with a transfer mode, which is what we're doing in these little cells here. That's pointed to in the red. And basically, it just sort of works. You can use the, I guess the card view or whatever, but that doesn't, again, it doesn't really apply to any of those older devices. It really just pushes in insets, and that's kind of crappy. You want to you want to cut it out nice, right? And then snapping, you see this sort of all over the place in material design apps. Maybe you see it in the news, maybe you see it in, like Airbnb is one great example, and they actually wrote, I think, what I would consider one of the most definitive posts on this, where they actually describe how you do this. You've got a view pager, and you can swipe horizontally, and you can actually scroll the content with inside of there. Basically, the child reports it to the parent that something has changed or moved, and the parent is then responsible to propagate that change across children when they become active. And it's really just all about the listeners. It's kind of complex and annoying. I'd suggest just Googling Airbnb, view pager slidey thing, and you'll find it. That's what I did. So motion, here's a couple examples of motion coming up here. So we've actually done this for a while, but basically it changes our screens into these physical objects, right? They're sliding in, you've got depth and things scale and the alpha changes and stuff like that. And really this is just an old-fashioned view pager. It's nothing really material, but it falls right in line with that. And then here's some animation detail. When you long press a pin, you actually get this contextual menu, and you can notice there's a little spring in it. Not too much that it's clowny, but just enough that it kind of feels like a real thing that you're touching, and it kind of sneaks away from you a little bit, and then it snaps in. But we have our own library for this, but really you can just go grab something off the shelf like Rebound from Facebook. And the details really matter here. The original engineer who built this, he spent just hours and long nights and weekends and just forever getting this thing right. And we actually still continue to tweak this in many releases. And Sheets, I've actually been asked this question quite a bit, just in random or whatever. But we've been using sort of this idea of Sheets too. And it's actually really a simple thing. It's either a transparent fragment activity, whatever. You just lay it on top of another fragment or activity. And then inside there, you've got a list view with a header. And it just bumps everything down, and then you can slide it in with a simple animation from the bottom. It's really that simple. I'm sure there's more elegant ways to do it, but this is the easiest, and it's just so simple and it's a shame that you just don't get it for free from the framework. So in conclusion, implement more process than you think you'll need. Continually revisit, because it's going to sneak up on you, and it's going to happen at the worst time. We've been there not too far ago. And you should support the biggest chunk of users that are applicable for your platform or app or company. And again, that can be different, right? If you're really going for that niche market in a different part of the world, like maybe you do need to just focus on froyo and gingerbread. Maybe that's what you need. But for a lot of consumer apps just to start out, supporting 15 through 19 is a great first start. And then we used material guidelines as inspiration. We didn't actually take it as the law. We implemented things here and there. Some things already fit, and we just retooled them a little bit. And you'll need to build some of that stuff yourself. And that's it. Thank you.
Let's give Luke Robluski, Carl, and Wendy one more round of applause. Thank you all for coming out tonight. If you have any more questions, you can check out our blog. We're revamping this right now, so you'll see a couple of changes there. But most of the things that have been talked about can be found there. We're wrapping up now, but you're free to stay, mingle. There's more drinks and more food. So thank you very much for coming. Have a great evening.